So this is a talk on Drag the Dots, which is a game that I made. It's actually two talks, which you guys get to choose which one you want. There's a technical talk, which talks more about the code itself and the techniques I use to build it in the code bias. And there's a theoretical one, which is more about the principles that I use to come up with my game and some of the issues I faced with regards to giving out to users and publishing it in the various different app stores. So by a show of hands, who would like to see it more of a technical talk about code? And who would want to see a theoretical talk?
We lose.
And who doesn't really want to vote? Okay. That looked about even to me. I don't really want to bore you with two talks. You can be the swing vote. Right. I've got two options for this talk. I'm going to do a technical one, which is more about the code. I'm going to do a theoretical one, which is more about how...
Oh my god, the game choices are terrible.
Go technical? Okay. So by an overwhelming majority, we're going with the technical.
I am the majority.
I'll take a recount.
So what is Drag the Dots? There you go, responsive design. It is a simple mobile game which I built using Phonegap, and I released it in both the iOS and Google Play stores. I also released it in the Amazon store and got about 3 downloads, so I don't really talk about that. So here's an example of me quickly playing Drag the Dots. So there's a variety of different screens, you work your way through them. There's a timer running at the top of the page, and you just have to drag 1 onto 1, 2 onto 2, 3 onto 3, 4 onto 4, and then so on. And I've got 13 seconds, which is pretty poor. But that's the idea of the game, and then you play a game, and you can go and check the high scores. And I don't have any high scores. And that's basically the whole game. There's different layout levels with different layouts of different combinations of dots.
You just played, so how come you don't know how to score?
I don't know. I'm trying not to think about that. There it is. There we go. There's my score of 13.
4.2.
How did I get 4.2?
Yeah.
We'll have a showcase at the end
It's the
with
same reason
Kerry
Kerry
getting
will get
1.8.
1.8.
What?
Yeah. There's a few people in the room who have got seriously good at this game in a very short amount of time.
Does it have microtransactions?
It doesn't have microtransactions. One day, maybe, if I sell out, I will. No. One of the big drivers for me was to make sure it was completely free, and that if people wanted to play it, they'd play it. And if they didn't, then they didn't, and I'd be sad. But people have been playing it on and off. This section is about how it was made. So I'm going to go through all of these subjects and talk about them. So Phonegap is a native wrapper that runs on Android or iOS or all of the others, and it's a native wrapper around HTML, CSS and JavaScript. So everything that you produce is inside of a web view. If you know what a web view is, it's basically like a little browser, and it exposes a few APIs to the phone, so you can access things like the vibrate and accelerometers and other kind of APIs to get the most interaction out of the device. Because of the way it's built, it's really, really cross-platform. It covers iOS, Android, Windows Phone, BlackBerry, and then I've also managed to port Drag the Dots to Windows 8 and actually OS X as well as an app. And that's all by using HTML, CSS and JavaScript as my code base. It's easy to write if you know HTML, CSS and JavaScript. It's quite an interesting way of working because you're in a closed environment. You don't have to worry about visitors. You don't have to package it in the same way as a website. You can treat it more like an app. It does, however, lack some of the native UIs that you get and some of the native performance. So if you're building something with lots and lots of data and lots of moving things around, it tends to chug a little bit just because it's not quite got that same rendering speed. But it's pretty good, and it's ideal for go-it-alone projects. So if you're just building a one-off thing that has to go out there, I helped a client build a calculator tool for calculating feed costs for selling feed to farmers, and they just installed it on the app on their iPads, and the salesman went out and they just basically just a more sophisticated calculator with their own algorithms in it for doing scaling calculations and things. But that was all just JavaScript and HTML, really straightforward to do inputs and outputs. So
Did you look at any of the other ones for that?
I did.
I can't remember the name of the other one. Was it Thribbulum or
There's Titanium.
Titanium?
Titanium works quite differently. You can't just use the web APIs like you can in this.
That's the JavaScript one as well, the HTML.
It's JavaScript that cross compiles into native code, so it behaves quite
So
differently.
Phonegap's the only one which does HTML front end, is it?
Yes, it's the only way you build templates with HTML. So here's the Phonegap website. As you can see, they've got some quite big clients. They did Browser Quest, which was the big Mozilla MMO, if anyone played that. It's done in Canvas, it was really nicely done. They used to get that cross-platform. So yeah, a lot of the apps that people build with Phonegap are more light-hearted. They're not kind of heavy, hard-going data apps because they just don't have performance. But they're great if you're showcasing a series of images or kind of performance isn't your main aim. So yeah, it's a single page app. So although in Phonegap you can link between different HTML pages because they didn't want that flash of unstarted content, I just packaged all of the content of the page is all separate sections, and they're shown and hidden with JavaScript rather than linking between them. That also meant that any JavaScript I wrote, if I initialized any variables or set anything to window, it would persist as long as the app was running, which was really, really handy because if you had to keep reinitializing stuff every time someone went to a menu or left a menu, you'd be doing a lot more code, a lot more thinking through how everything was tracked. So it let you keep a consistent style and a consistent state. And it's also quite useful because if you want to start doing WYSI transitions or anything, you can just do it all with the JavaScript and move divs around without having to think about doing behind-the-scenes AJAX loading or anything else. So it started out with a jQuery draggable div, and I just dragged it around and went, oh, that's quite fun, I'll have a go, I'll do something else. And then for each div, I gave it a target, which was the ID of the next div that it's supposed to be dragged onto. And then I used a bit of maths to work out whether or not they were in range of each other. And then if they're in range, then one of them disappears, and the other one gets replaced by gets the number on it incremented and the styles of it changed to go to the next div, and so on. So yeah, when it collides, it triggers the next state and carries on as a chain.
Anders?
Yeah.
You have to also release or just on collision?
You do have to release. So how it works is that jQuery draggable, when you define the object, there's an on-drop callback.
Yeah.
So I'm listening for the drop. So you can actually drag them over the top of each other, and they don't let go. So you have to let go at the right time. Kerry's got the technique down of dropping it just in the right spot. But I think if you just dragged it over the top, it would actually be a little bit too easy because you wouldn't have to be precise. You could just drag it all over the place until it hit.
In Safari, that's not in a web view. If you don't release your finger, you don't get the event. Does jQuery still check your collision even if you don't let go? The touch event on Safari native one doesn't seem to fire if you don't let go. Like you don't get the on up or whatever.
So I'm using a plugin to jQuery UI called jQuery Touch Punch that uses the the touch end as well as the touch start to replace mouse down, mouse up.
Yeah.
So it's actually using the native touch events. I have done a fork of this where I did it using multi-touch, so I actually did everything using the touch events, and I ran into some weird overlapping issues and all sorts of weird rendering issues with it.
And if you did it with so if you recoded it so it would do just collision, that worked okay. So you didn't have to take your finger off. So
Yeah,
it would
but
still work.
It kind of spoiled the game
Okay,
because
so
it didn't have the same precision. Or it really should be called drop the dots, not drag. But the name came and stuck. I've written all of the JavaScript in CoffeeScript, which is a language that compiles to JavaScript. Any FESuffolk regulars or anyone who's talked to me for any period of time will know that I love CoffeeScript, and I think it's great. So I wrote each piece of divisible functionality. So I kind of built these classes that could track individual bits. So I had one for screens, one for gameplay, one for collisions, one for keeping track of the timer, one for fetching stuff with Ajax from the scoreboards. Each of those were separate CoffeeScript classes that were distinct, and if I needed to disable any for any specific game, or if I wanted to refactor any of them, I could just rewrite just that bit and nothing else would be broken. So yeah, an example of this is that I swapped out all the stuff to do with collision for multi-touch, and it was just one branch where I changed one file rather than me having to rewrite everything and everything to fit together. I'm also doing another one where I'm changing the rendering, because at the moment using native jQuery draggable, it uses top and left and absolute positioning to move things around. I'm going to upgrade that to use the CSS 3D transforms, because they use the graphics card. It's a lot faster, and for some of the stuff I've got coming up, I need it to start speeding up. So here's an example of a CoffeeScript class. As you can see, it's a bit JavaScripty, but not amazingly. So this is a class called Collisions, and it has a listener that says if there's a collision, do some maths, and then hidden away in here is some maths about how it all fits together, and then at the bottom we've got an example of how you might trigger that object. So I have one central object in the whole app where all my events get fired and they all get listened to, and that gets passed into every single CoffeeScript class, and then it can then track each individual one, and I shall talk about events in the next slide. So it's event driven, and this is part of the keeping the concern separated, is that rather than calling functions directly from other elements of the JavaScript, you fire off an event and then other elements listen for it. It's called the observer pattern, and it allows things to happen without, it requires no knowledge of anything else happening in the program, which lets everything be much more separate and get on with it. Things like the gameplay UI screens and timers were really, really good for this kind of thing. So when the timer ran out, it fired an event and everything just reacted. It just went, oh, timer's run out, better show a new screen, better stop the clock, better work out their scores, better log their scores in local storage, everything else. I also did a debugging module that just listened to all of the events that were being fired and logged them out for me, so that if there was anything broken or I was expecting an event to occur, it would be really obvious. So any gap in my functionality, there wasn't an event in the log, which made debugging was a lot easier. All of the communication with the server, I used JSON-P. Who knows what JSON-P is?
Isn't it just
You?
JC, just method rundown.
It's a script tag. So JavaScript inserts a script tag and then tries to run it. So it's a bit of a wobbly, dodgy way of doing it, but basically allows you to pull data back from other servers that you aren't, so you don't have the cross-domain issues. But it's quite handy for things like this, where you need to have your server running somewhere, and each individual Phonegap instance, you don't know where it is, you don't know what it is, you don't know what it's running on, because it's just flat files, so it could be anywhere, it could be running on anything. So JSON-P allowed me to make much quicker cross-platform calls. And yeah, because they're not served, you can't really use something like cores, because often they require you to have a set password or have a set origin. And Leaky looks like he's about to say that a better way of doing cores.
Oh,
Yes, I'd be very interested to see some other ways of doing this, because JSON-P does feel like a bit of a hack, and I'd rather kind of...
why do you think it's hack, JSON-P?
Because you're creating a JavaScript file on the
No,
fly.
you're creating a data file which is then passed by jQuery, which will do any injection attacks, mitigate those.
I don't know. I think I've had much better experiences with more traditional web development and things like cores. I think I feel better about the security of it. But ideally, this should all really, because the main thing I'm using it for is maintaining the high scores in the database. Ideally, I should be using the in-game services from Apple and Google, because they have their own APIs and they go, oh, you want to do a scoreboard? Use our scoreboard API. You want to do high score of the week, use this API, and it's much, much easier to do. However, I didn't find very good support for those in Phonegap, so I had to kind of roll my own.
There's cool things like Firebase and stuff that's specifically for databases, for games developers that
Yeah?
have JavaScript APIs. There's databases, but they're already on JavaScript APIs, so you don't have to care about actually say install this data. So
That's quite good.
Firebase and a couple of others out there, like quite generous free tiers for
Hmm.
you don't have to pay.
I'll have a look.
Yeah, worth a look, they're not good. No reason.
My database is just a Rails server I've got running on Heroku, which I just post stuff up to. So in order to keep track of everything locally, because when you shut down a Phonegap app and reload it, you've effectively done a page refresh. You need to find a way of storing your data locally. And if you're doing native development, you might use something like SQLite 3, or I think there's some other options for doing persisting things locally in memory. In the browser, you can use. How's that become roundup? That's interesting.
It's the German subsidiary.
Probably is. Yeah. You can use the local storage API. It's basically a key value pair that the browser lets you keep in memory, and you can store strings in it. But because you can store strings in it, you can store JSON in it. So you can build quite complex structures, and then just use JSON parse to kind of put it together. The only thing to watch out with local storage is that theoretically you can lose it at any point because the user might choose to clear all of their browser cache, and I think the browser cache also gets cleared out of things in Phonegap as well. So I've only stored things like people's local high scores and people's settings, which they can then refresh, and then eventually I'll get local high scores syncing with remote high scores, so that if you're on the internet, it'll refresh anyway and you won't lose anything major. But it's ideal if you're playing on the train or on the tunnel or whatever.
Does Phonegap not have any APIs, storage APIs for the native?
I don't know. They always recommend using local storage, I think, because the HTML5 API is so straightforward and it covers a lot of the use cases. I think the argument would be if you wanted to do that level of storage, much the same as if you wanted to do intensive image processing or anything that required serious amounts of network time, like local Wi-Fi games and things, you do it native rather than Phonegap.
They got quite high capacity limits.
Depends. I suppose you can't store gigs and gigs, but I think you can get 100 megs or something. It's not level. I don't think I'm ever going to run over it. I think I'd have to work pretty hard to get some serious high scores.
Kerry might do.
Kerry might do. Well, the other thing is that I have capped it just for sanity's sake, so that your local high scores, it only remembers your 10 best ones. So just before it stores it, it does a quick check against the ones that are there. And if your score doesn't beat your 10 best ones, it doesn't remember it. So I've already kind of capped the amount of data that could be stored anyway. That's more for sanity rather than anything else. You can tell I'm quite worried about my sanity during development. So the release process is just some bits about what I do to actually produce a new version of it and send it out. So I use a service called Phonegap Build, which is basically what Phonegap found was that although people enjoyed using Phonegap and they enjoyed building sites and everything, the actual process of setting up all the APIs, all the emulators, everything else was a real ball ache. So they put everything in the cloud so that now you can provide them with an API key for the service you're going to be using. Or if you're doing Apple, you send up your provisioning certificates and you give them your secret key, which sounds a bit dodgy, but it's fine. And it pulls, you sign in with your GitHub account, and it pulls the repo that you specify, looks in it and goes, that's a chunk of HTML, wraps it in Phonegap, does some churning in the background, and sends you back a file that works, which is, it's actually really fast. It's about as fast as doing it on your own computer, but you don't have to worry about where you installed your latest Android APKs. So yeah, you still have to go through the process of creating your own certificates and provisioning, but once you've done that, it's pretty straightforward and you just have to keep up to sync. Phonegap Build uses an XML file that you use to describe your app, so you describe your things like any orientation locking you're doing, any specific APIs you want to use. So if you want to use the vibration, for example, say I want to use a vibration API in the XML format. And then you just download your IPAs or APKs, and with your APKs it's literally a file you download and you submit to the Play Store, or you just install on your phone if you just want to play on it locally. And your IPAs, you need to put them in the Connect store for Apple and then upload it. But Apple have actually done a huge amount of work recently to try and improve the whole certificate provisioning process. It's getting a lot better. It used to be a complete headache.
Do you need a paid account to test locally?
Not to test locally. In
So
fact,
you can load on the emulator on your Mac?
you can load it. I just test it straight on my device, or I test it on. I just test it on my iPad.
for the device on iOS, you still
You still need your developer licenses.
Yes.
So you need your.
But you don't need a paid one, do you?
Yes, you do.
You do.
Because when I do mono stuff, I can just test that on the Mac in the emulator. It's only when you go to do the whole signing process.
Yes, as soon as you want it on the device, then you need these.
Yeah, I'm just talking about the emulator on the
But
PC.
no, you don't.
On the lap.
So it's basically the same rules as if you were doing normal native development. So all it's doing is it's taking the compilation phase stage and putting it somewhere else. You do still have to have iTunes installed. I haven't got any Android software installed at all. That's just fine. But yeah, it's really fast. It's really quick. I'd recommend it, especially if you're just putting your toe in and trying it out. It saves you spending a lot of time configuring. It's ideal if you've got a client mobile website or mobile site or app that you need to build, and you just want to see if Phonegap's good as technology. Use Phonegap build. Don't try and set everything up because you'll lose an entire afternoon. Whereas this, it's 20 minutes or so. So they've got loads. They're really trying to push this because it's
At the top it says Adobe Phonegap build. Do Adobe own Phonegap?
Adobe and Phonegap.
I did not know that.
They bought it 2 or 3 years ago, I think. And they've kind of kept the Adobe bit a bit secret. I don't know if they don't want to be taken.
Not there, they haven't.
Not there, they haven't. But when people talk about it, you don't talk about it as Adobe Phonegap in the same way you might talk about it.
Is it like Fight Club? First rule of Adobe Phonegap is you don't talk about Adobe.
They've got it's open source, but then they have their own.
Is it Cordova?
Yeah,
Cordova, yeah. It's based on Cordova, which is Apache, I think.
Yeah.
Has Cordova. But it's based on a kind of a variety of different structures. But the one I used to do Mac development was called Phonegap, and that was completely open source straight from GitHub. You just literally clone it down. It's an Xcode project. Stick your HTML in a public folder and run it, and you suddenly have a Mac app. It's amazing. But yeah, so Phonegap build's brilliant. And I kind of have a cycle which I run through, which involves the word code every time, unsurprisingly. So if I want to do a new release or some new things, I write some code, then I test it, then I push it to GitHub, then I run it through Phonegap build, then I download it, then I test it again, then I change it, then I test it again, then I send it, and then finally when I run it through enough tests and I'm happy with it, that's when I finally release it. But it's very much, there was a while for this where I was doing 2 or 3 releases every day. I was spending a bit too much time on it. And it was I was getting into this whole mantra of, if I run these tests, if I push this, and it was quite good, it was quite quick. Using Git to do all of your pushing and all of your building. In Phonegap build, you literally press the pull from GitHub button and it's in, so you don't have to worry about uploading anything. So how I actually test it, I run it locally on a server, and then I test it in Chrome first, which
Used to be WebKit.
used to be WebKit, but it covers, if it works in Chrome, most of the APIs will be fine elsewhere. So this is me running my latest build version in Chrome. I've kind of built it in such a way that it's quite responsive, and you can go and play a game. And then I test it in the iOS simulator. basically looks the same on the iOS.
So start with export and then do that.
I haven't got time for Xcode just now. It basically is, I run it in Safari and iOS because Safari and a web view are so close. Modern Safari has a few more options than a web view, but for what I'm testing, it's literally a case of, is it going to break? Test it in there, and then I test it on my phone because I'm running it from a local server. And then I do the Phonegap builds in test mode, download an APK, run it on my phone again, then I test it on my iPad, and then it's ready to go. So it's quite a long process, but it's quite good to just test on lots of different devices. And if you're doing things for tablets and phones, be ready for a lot of testing because it can be really different between them. So what next? The drag the dots. I kind of stopped doing releases before Christmas, and I've got more stuff to do and push out, but there's lots of half-finished bits, and I've got lots of polishing off to do. I'd quite like to do a local multiplayer, so you have two people trying to drag dots on the same iPad, which will be quite fist-punching inducing. I think I'd quite like to go through and do some refactoring and some code reformatting. Maybe I'll see if I can get anyone else to have a look at the code and say, what are you doing with that, you idiot? Just cut out that for loop, you're not even using that. Thankfully, I'm hoping that's not going to be true. And I'd like to bring in colour themes as well. So yeah, in terms of more releases, I'd like to start to get into a pattern of releasing. It's one thing about game development and kind of development in general is that the idea of things being finished and done and getting rid of them doesn't really exist anymore. You don't get to stop a project unless someone stops paying you and paying you in the first place. If no one's paying you in the first place, you might as well sign your whole life away to it because you'll just keep going. You'll go, oh, I've already put in so many weeks' work, I might as well put in another hour and then you don't get to sleep. So I'd like to get a much better pattern for releases every 2 weeks or so. One thing I found was that if I thought of something and I thought it was exciting and I thought, oh, I'll do that and get it in, I'd rush through everything and then I'd release it and then a day later I'd go, oh, but I can change it in this way, and then I'd do another release, and that was getting really annoying for me because I was getting worn out and not pacing myself, and then also for the end user it's becoming less and less so because people have got downloads in the background, but it's still frustrating to have to always keep updating apps, and everyone's got that one app on their phone that always needs an update. I don't know what it is for most people, but I think for me it's Instagram. It seems to always need updating. I don't even use it, but I still update it. So yeah, regular releases helps to bring order and it's less annoying. Yeah, I kind of want to release some features for tablet users because it's been very, very phone-based at the moment. And also I think that I quite like the idea of a local multiplayer game because often people play more games online or they're all on separate phones. But the idea of everyone having to crowd in around one thing I think is quite good. And it could push the game in new directions as well.
There's actually a website dedicated to apps, to games that are local multiplayer on one device.
Oh, that's quite good. Yeah.
It's called Punch Your Friends by playing games on an iPad.com.
I know, but the games,
Break your friend's iPad.
the games that are really interesting in terms of mechanics and how they've developed the gameplay.
That's cool. Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely, there's a lot of stuff, especially in indie games as well. There's a lot of people thinking about different ways of inputting and different ways of making and what is a game in the first place. So yeah, I think making my code more modular and extensible. One thing I'd like to do is be able to have a go at making a second Phonegap game using a lot of the drag the dots code without having to kind of, and have it with a completely different mechanic, but using the same thing for doing all the UI and the menus and the scoreboards and everything else, and make sure my code is recyclable and reusable. And if it is and it works, make sure it's open source and people can use it and enjoy it. Colour themes. My colour schemes are pretty arbitrary in terms of the colours that I've picked. I've literally got a colour wheel of using hue, saturation and lightness in CSS, and I've literally just gone, so there's 12 of them, what's 360 divided by 12, and then incremented by that amount. So the colours are always quite consistent and quite plain. I'd quite like for there to be more interesting colour schemes. I did create a grayscale colour scheme, which makes the game a lot harder because you can barely see what's going on. and I've created some schemes where you can't see the numbers or you can't see the backgrounds. And although it doesn't change anything particularly functionally, it changes the experience, it changes the difficulty of the game. And also, be able to create more choices for a user can be good. And it'd be great if I could find some other developers or causes or anything that I want to do cross-promotion for as well. Or I could just do a Christmas theme.
You'll wait for a long time for that.
At my current release schedule, I'll do next year's Christmas. And that's it for Drag the Dots. Any questions?
What test frameworks are you using for testing the JavaScript?
That's a fantastic question. And the answer is that I wrote 3/4 of a Jasmine test framework and then got more excited about building features that are properly implemented it. So I'm doing horrific manual testing of, I've edited the bit, because I've written all the code myself and it's a relatively small code base, I know I don't use my mind in manual testing, but ideally I'd be able to do, I want to use Jasmine and do behavior-driven development. Again, the eventing structure would help with that. And also if I'm looking to get any other developers involved, I need to have a test framework, otherwise how could anyone else work?
No, I was just interested because we've done a little bit with Jasmine, and again, sort of, trying to write tests which are picking up on events in Jasmine. It's just quite interesting.
Events are really weird because they feel like they're really hard work and they feel like, why don't I just do a function call? I'm only using this once or twice. But the advantage you get is you really can break it down into as small as possible bit of behaviour, and you can just spoof it and send through whatever you like. Especially if you're doing, I've found it's really good if you're doing anything that involves any maths or calculation, especially if it's layout or positioning to do with distance. If you're, so one of them is called circle, and one of the layouts is called circle, and it puts the dots in a circle. For me to test the maths of that, I would just fire off an event with 2 and I'd make sure they were opposite, and 4 and make sure they were, and that kind of was a quite good structure. David?
Did you think much about online multiplayer at all, or are you totally thinking local?
I'm totally thinking local at the moment, just because for one thing, because I'm thinking about phones more than devices, I don't know if I wanted them to be on at least a Wi-Fi connection, because I wouldn't really want to rinse someone's mobile allowance.
Right, because it would do it
just because it would be doing lots and lots of polling to be able to play it in any kind of real time.
I see.
And the other thing is that my server at the moment doesn't really handle, I've not written it to do concurrent requests, I've literally done it to just post and retrieve data. So I'd have to sort out WebSockets and some kind of either a fallback to be doing, so an asynchronous.
Right. So it's a technical thing as well as you don't want people to
and I think most people play games on their phones on their own. I think.
Yeah, I was just thinking of QuizUp.
Sorry?
An app called QuizUp, I don't know. It's quite quick playing against each other, and you sort of find an opponent. You sign up and you choose a topic, and anyone else that wants to play that topic at that time, you play against them. Sort of thing.
That's quite good.
You could do it with yours, as in you don't show the numbers, and the first one to get the right one. Sort of, obviously, there's no skill to it, but it's sort of
it's like a reaction thing.
Then you could ban Kerry.
I could ban Kerry. I was tempted to put Kerry mode in, where everything would go at half the speed. But then if you put in your username as Kerry, everything went slightly slower.
We forced them to work over the 3G network, it's called 2G, and everyone else is on Wi-Fi.
That would help.
What about
Via Bluetooth? I'm not aware of the Bluetooth APIs being exposed to Phonegap. I think they probably are, or you could write a connector pretty quickly. Again, part of this was just simplicity, and I really wanted to get something made and out rather than trying to extend it too much. Again, this is part of the thing about having a release or an iterative process, is that you can introduce it later, or when you get that sponsorship from Google or whoever, and they all pay for it all, and you just sit back. Any more questions? Oh, Martin?
We've been by the Android side of things, and such a diverse range of screen sizes and hardware and versions of the OS.
I had a few instances of people having a choppy experience to do with their web views and the fact that I'm using circular divs. Some people, when you had two divs overlapping, there were rendering issues. One of them was on someone's S4. It was only on one person's S4, and I tried it on 3 different ones. It was only on one of them. I don't know what's going on there.
The manufacturer could have put some.
I don't know.
Like O2 or Vodafone could.
I don't know. And the only other issues I had, because I tried to keep everything, I built it like a responsive site, so I made everything responsive anyway. And because I locked everything in portrait, it always had that right sort of rough shape. If you play, there's a few levels. There's a level called random, where they're randomly spaced over the screen. If you play that on a Nexus 7, you're at a disadvantage compared to someone playing on a Nexus 4 because it's spread out more. And there's a few other little subtle changes, but mostly because a lot of people play against themselves, they just, as long as they've got continuous experience, it's kind of alright. So I did test it on a few incredibly old phones running Android 2.1 maybe, I think, and it ran a little bit slow, but it was still playable. Some of the more complex ones where there was more dots on the
You
screen.
weren't forced to sort of whack up the compatibility. I assume you can set the compatibility for it and rule.
You can. How Phonegap normally does it is that it has a look at which features you're using, and it does it based on that. So for a little while I put a vibration feature in, and that raised it from 1.6 to 2.2, just because most 1.6 phones didn't have the vibration API for apps. Any more questions?
Sure. With the colour schemes,
Yeah.
did anyone complain about them for things like colour blindness or anything like that?
My girlfriend's aunt she has visibility problems. She has a black circle in the middle of her vision, and she has to have everything, when she uses her computer, it's amazing because her mouse literally covers 1/8 of the screen. And she found it was actually quite good in terms of the coloured background. I gave her a version where the background colour didn't change, it was white, and that seemed to be fine in terms of accessibility issues. I think accessibility issues in games, in terms of colours, are not very well covered at all. And I don't mean to jump on the bandwagon, but I think if I tried to make it a priority, I probably would have struggled. But I don't think my user base was really big enough for me to start having issues. I guess I could, in theory, do a different colour scheme. I could put a drop shadow or something and give it the higher contrast backgrounds, or I don't know, could just try and do a high visibility mode.
Do you think that people have higher expectations because it looks a bit like that test they make you take to see if you're colourblind, which is just got a coloured background with coloured dots on it?
Just looking for any excuse I could get for weak scores.
Anyone else? Any more questions? Yeah.
How much time and love has gone into this?
I first thought of it when I was on holiday last year. That would have been October, I think. Probably a couple of weeks of development.
Yeah.
Overall, but I mean, it's been lots of dipping in and out, and a lot of it's just been me excitedly checking my records on my rail server and going, there's someone I don't recognise on the scoreboards. This is amazing.
Have you thought about changing it such that the timer doesn't start until you do the first drag?
I don't. Well, some of them, for random, for example, I quite like the idea that you have to. So someone actually asked for the interim screen as a feature request. This one with a go, and it was based on the idea of people having Rubik's cubes, and they hit the timer then go.
Yeah.
I think if I left it to be on the first drag, I think you'd be able to spot it too quickly. And part of the,
yeah, that's the difference between a normal person and Gary.
One of the big differences.
It takes 2 seconds for me to actually see that there's actually numbers on the screen.
Yeah. So yeah, spotting the numbers. I mean, some of them do start to get pretty brutal in terms of spotting, reading numbers. So I'll be able to spot which one is which.
At least he slowed it down a bit from the original.
I have slowed down. The original literally went as fast as the phone could let you go. And
Well, they're just blurs at that speed.
they were.
Kind of
But they were vague.
Some of them pointier than others.
Right.
It was a challenge.
They gave you an epileptic fit.
Yes, it's odd. I've got some new ones which are still very much in development. There's this one where they all move as you move, and they get faster as well as you go up the numbers. So that's actually increasing their X and Y by the amount of number on the dot. So 5 is moving at 5 times the speed at which you move it. And I've got another one here called Maze, which is where you have to drag them through the maze to the other side. And if you hit the side, it drops it. So actually getting through. These ones I'm waiting. Yeah, it's fiddly.
Is the maze always the same?
No, the maze is randomly generated. So if you quit and do maze again.
Do you have a way of monitoring which screens or which variations get played more than others?
The only method I have, well, the new version of this automatically posts your score for you if you don't turn it off, and if you're online. So once the new version's in, I'll be able to see by people just posting their scores and tracking on the server. Google Analytics does have a mobile API, and people have done variations on it that actually fire off Google Analytics events on specific page loads or JavaScript events, so you can just, in JavaScript, go, this is happening. I think if you wanted to roll your own, you could probably just post to local storage and say, and just have an array of, of all your level types, and then just increment the number each time someone loads it. I don't, but it probably is worth doing, just to see which ones are more popular.
Can I check out a couple more quick ones?
Yeah, of course.
One is, how many downloads have you had, and what would you do for,
Over 500?
To get user feedback?
To get user feedback, the first thing I did is that everyone I ran into, including strangers on buses, trains and things, I told them about it and said, I've got a free game in the iOS store, I've made it, can you have a go? And often people go, oh, you like this game? Oh, you made it? And the fact that you've made something that's on their phone and they can play and have, for the general public and for lots of people, to actually be in front of someone who has made something on their phone is quite a weird experience. I realise for developers and game designers and things, it's quite normal. You just go, oh yeah, well, that guy made a game, I made a game, I made a game. But to actually have, to say to someone, oh, I'm particularly weird, so if I see someone looking pretty bored playing with their phone, I'll go, yeah, I've made a game, do you mind testing out for me? And often people are quite gracious. I mean, a couple of people go, oh, I'm getting off the next stop, sorry. But basically everyone I know just says, please try Dragon Dots, please try it, please rate it, please enjoy it. And I've had lots of feedback. I was doing a contract on it at Astral Park, so I was meeting with the BT gang for lunch. And just after I literally just released it to the Android store, I went and I told them about it, and within about 5 minutes they were all playing it in front of me. And I was getting bug requests, feature requests, actually just in person, just going, yeah, this bit's broken, yeah, this isn't default Android behaviour. Actually, most of this was from one guy, but it was all kind of coming in. And a lot of the feedback has actually just been from people I've met, people I know, who just go, I prefer this to be like this. Obviously, I can't do all the feature requests, and some of them are features and not bugs, and things like that. The first time people played the one with the spinning, I got a lot of people going, yeah, I can't see the numbers. And I was like, that's the point. Any more questions?
Mine isn't a question, it's just, I don't know if they'll actually do it, but now that you've discovered you've got a new gadget, I don't think anyone realises how fast Kerry is at that. Can you try and get him to do it on the new Gizmo?
Would you mind, Kerry?
Now
we've got the Gizmo.
I didn't know the Gizmo existed before an hour ago, Kerry, but now that we've seen it, we may as well use it.
Yeah, it's going to transform FESuffolk, I think. Right.
You also need to turn it on first.
You
have also got the game open ready.
Well,
Burgundy, so I'm not ready.
I noticed, Anders, that on iOS, Drag the Dots breaks the XKCD cartoon about ratings in the App Store. you've got a 5-star review, but you've got 7 reviews. That should be possible.
And
The
they're all from
KCD
people I
said-
know.
The KCD says if you get 5 stars, that's 1 review.
Oh, I see.
Because if you get 10,000 reviews, 1 person scores it anything lower than 5 stars, you don't get 5 stars.
Now, Kerry, you're going to be playing a bit awkwardly. You have to make allowances.
Can you move the projector general?
Yeah, it's just-
Ah.
Queen's to zoom out.
This is
No pressure.
best technology there's ever been.
We have OHPs as well. I think all in the old covers.
I literally, I'm not kidding, I think some people miss that. Can you do the same one again?
It won't work this time.
Is it recording? Can we slow it down?
It is recorded.
Let's go this time. See, it's
Yeah, Kerry's the only person because there's 2.4 really. So.
it's getting worse. Right, yes.
So I did a video on YouTube of Kerry getting 2 and I posted it, and there were people who I didn't really know were going, how did you do that?
Well done. I've been competitions. I thought 2 was quite good. Oh, 1.9, right.
So yeah, if you want something thoroughly tested, try and get the guys at BT interested. Really well. Cool. Thank you very much, everyone.